Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Traditionally, New York City has called itself the Big Apple, but these days they might want to rename themselves the Big Crapple. Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD, who moonlights as the city's mayor, has been trying and failing to whore himself more effectively to his white paymasters. He's good at being a meat puppet for them, but not much else. For many months now, in fact the last 2 or so years, Officer Adams has been demanding that people who have been working from home go back to work, as he keeps saying. Never mind that they are working, they're just working from home. But he wasn't alone. You've had a number of politicians and political pundits saying the same lie, talking about remote workers as if they're on strike. Now keep in mind, these exact same people don't talk that way about people in India or the Philippines who work in call centers for American corporations. Apparently, those people are not treated as if they're not going to work when they're doing the exact same thing. So Eric Adams and the white media and the white corporate interests that he's acting as a mouthpiece for, they don't care that people are working. They don't care that people are doing the exact same job that they were always doing and being just as productive, in fact, more productive, because they don't have to leave the office unexpectedly to take care of something at home. Now they are at home full time. So if they're working and being just as productive, if not more so than they were before, then why are these politicians and pundits dogging them out and talking about them as if they've been on strike or on some vacation? Why are they lying like this? Because what Eric Adams has really been saying is, go back to your boss's office. But why? It's not for efficiency. Officer Adams tried to use all manner of pathetic arguments, which clearly were spoon-fed to him by his white corporate masters, the ones who were demanding that people come back to their offices. He spouts their hollow, self-serving gibberish, and then he can't understand why the people of New York just laugh at him. He actually tried to make what for him was supposed to be a moralistic argument. Notice I said moralistic. I didn't say moral. Officer Adams' whine was that it's not fair that there are people who mop floors in these office buildings and people who serve fast food in the center of the city, and the people who are supposed to be working for these big firms or are supposed to be going to these restaurants downtown are working from home. Well, that's because you can't mop floors or make hamburgers over an internet connection. And then Officer Adams made the asinine argument that people have to go back to the office because he's doing it. Well, that's his job as mandated by the laws of New York City. He has to be there personally. Again, he's making arguments that are irrelevant in terms of law, morality, and common sense. And yet he kept on whining. When his earlier lies and deflections and subterfuge failed, eventually Officer Adams was forced to come out and say the real reason. The work-from-home employees are hurting the economy downtown, including the government. The companies in the center of Manhattan base their businesses around having tons of office workers to sell their goods and services to. And with everyone staying at home, these companies are hurting. And this includes the office workers' own employers, too. And how are these employers hurting? Well, big corporations in downtown Manhattan pay a lot of money for their commercial real estate, and it hurts them not to have people using it because they can't justify the expense. Remember, those buildings are not just some cubicle barnyard. They're also part of someone's very valuable multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio. And when those buildings sit empty, it's a huge problem. The white media wasn't talking about it before that much when the pandemic lockdowns began because it wasn't that big of a problem then. But a year passed, then 18 months, then 2 years, now 2.5 years, and it became apparent that these office workers weren't coming back. And the white media, who is the mouthpiece of organized white power, began screaming, "Oh, won't somebody think of the CEOs?" And since at least late 2021, we've seen the white media bombarding us heavy with stories talking about how remote workers are hurting the economy somehow, particularly the commercial real estate sector. This is where the white media's laid the blame, at the feet of the people who work from home and who refuse to come back to the office, which is located in the city centers. Bloomberg's propaganda network was saying last year that the commercial office building sector is facing a $1.1 trillion problem because their buildings are becoming obsolescent. Now, that was what they published last year. Does anyone think that that number has gone down since then? Also, if you look at what happened with malls, you see that when these buildings are sitting obsolete, they won't be repurposed. Well, not right away at least. Officer Adams of the NYPD went from sounding pathetic to eventually sounding threatening, as if he was going to start arresting people if they didn't go back to the office. In fact, a lot of businesses and mayors and governors across the country have been using the same coercive, threatening language toward employees, not because they're not working, but because the employees aren't working where they want them to. And why are they at the point of borderline violence about this? Yes, the real estate parasites who own these office buildings want to maintain the value of their property, and they're trying to get the government to help them force people to do it. But there's another interested party in all this that not too many people have been talking about. The banks. All those empty office buildings aren't really owned in most cases by the people who are leasing out that office space. In most cases, they are owned by the banks. As CNN Business wrote, the value of buildings such as offices is crashing. Crashing, they said. And this has investors and regulators scared, because there's already been a number of recent bank failures. Everyone's familiar with the subprime crisis of 2008, and what was that caused by? It was caused by a housing market, where people were buying homes that they couldn't actually make the payments on. Well, now the commercial real estate equivalent of the same problem is brewing and growing. If customers start getting concerned about their bank lending money to commercial real estate, that could trigger a run on the banks, which is exactly what toppled Silicon Valley Trust. CNN listed a number of commercial real estate that's taken a hit, from apartment complexes to warehouses to malls. But it's who CNN has blamed for this looming crisis that's really of interest. They're not blaming the people who are leasing out the office space for offices they can't afford. They're not blaming the banks for putting money into these things without having done due diligence. They're not blaming the corporations for buying office space that they didn't really need. Who are they blaming? They're blaming the employees, the people who are doing remote work. They're to blame. Or as CNN put it, work from home bill comes due. Yeah, they're not talking about all the stupid money that banks put in these office buildings comes due. They never ever blame the investor class because the white media happens to be the mouthpiece for those same investors, so they're not going to be criticizing themselves. But what CNN says about the work-from-home bill comes due, they mean that literally. About $270 billion in commercial real estate loans held by banks will come due this year. Roughly $80 billion of that is from office properties. So you got a lot of landlords out there who are going to have to come up with a lot of money that they don't have. The average occupancy of offices in the United States is still less than half of what it was in March of 2020. In other words, before the pandemic began. And how has this affected the office building sector? Quote, hybrid work remains popular, affecting the rents many building owners can charge. That's the problem. With people using their home as their office, who needs all those big buildings anymore? Nobody. So the landlords can't charge as much because their product isn't in demand. And considering that many of these buildings are financed by some banking institution or other, this becomes a problem for the banks the same way the subprime housing loan crisis did. CNN said that Goldman Sachs estimates that 55% of those office building loans are on some bank or another's balance sheet. So Bloomberg's looming $1.1 trillion obsolete office crisis is clearly a banking sector crisis. And what is the banking capital of the United States? Where are the vast majority of banks in the United States headquartered at? Where do they do most of their business from? New York City. But there's also another problem for the employers, corporations, government, and the white media that they don't want to talk about. The remote work phenomenon has also emboldened the workers. A lot of white media reports are now that a lot of people are making the decision on where they work based on whether the employers will allow them to work from home. Now, why do employers hate this so much? Because it represents a loss of control. When people are at the office, they can be monitored, they can be watched. One thing's for sure, they're not going to be looking for another job if you can make sure to keep tabs on them while they're at yours. The foundation of the employer-employee dynamic is that the employee has no leverage whatsoever. That's what it's based on. The employer can make any asinine demand they want, and they do. Everyone knows the employers are furious about remote working and the effect that it's had on the corporate owner's profits, but rather than knuckle under, employees have been pushing back. To employers, this is the tail wagging the dog, and it has to be stopped. They worked a long, long time to create the economic climate today where employees suffer in silence. For generations now, employees have been forced to do so many things that they absolutely hate. stressing themselves into an early grave, and they just took it without saying boo about it. But now, that's changed. Defiance of the employers has become popularized. Well, obviously, this is a trend that employers don't want to become habit-forming, because if employees are able to say where they will do their work, then sooner or later the employees are going to get enough gumption to start making demands about something that really matters, like how much they get paid. And that's the real employment crisis that these corporations and businessmen are trying to prevent. So now it becomes a lot more clear why Officer Adams has been losing his mind about this, and why his white financial backers have been so adamant that he get those people back into the offices by hook or by crook. Now also keep in mind, this flies in the face of all the benefits that remote work has brought, not just to the workplace, but also to the environment. The main driver of air pollution and the climate crisis has been motor vehicles. Since people began remote working, that's resulted in much less cars on the road. Less cars means less pollution and less traffic congestion, and less wear and tear on the infrastructure, which everybody knows is crumbling nationwide. But rather than lauding remote workers as a boon to the environment and congratulating America's workers for helping to protect the environment and the roads and everything else, Democrats have been silent on it. They didn't have a problem giving tax breaks for people to buy cars, especially electric cars, or to give tax incentives to employers for certain things. But when it comes to people doing remote work and how good this has been for the environment, you don't see Democrats trying to incentivize that. Gee, I wonder why. Remind me again what political party Officer Adams is a part of. Oh yeah, he's a Democrat. So both parties have been dancing to Wall Street's tune. As they see it, the American people are not people at all. They are nothing more than statistics, a number. Their purpose is to fuel the machine of the 1%. Fuel it through their labor, fuel it through their consumption, fuel it through their blind, unquestioning obedience. Make the people do it and make it clear they don't have a choice. And this way, everyone will understand that their real job is to obey. How much gasoline, how much pollution, how much time has been saved merely by people doing remote work? People are able to stay close to their children. All that dead, wasted time in their cars commuting or stuck on the train has been alleviated. They're far more likely to be able to get a sufficient amount of sleep, and that alone is a big benefit to their health. You would have to really struggle to find anything truly negative about the remote work phenomenon. But rather than welcome it, we see Democrats leading the charge to stop it. Because the problem is that while remote work is good for the workers, the environment, the infrastructure, and every other thing in the society, there's two entities that it's not good for: the investor class and the government. Less people going to work means less people buying goods and services. Less people going to work means less revenue for the city. They lose money on everything from traffic tickets to parking meters to you name it. When you see these governments putting fees in place and writing traffic tickets and such, these are actually taxes. That's why you see all these traffic cameras at every intersection. It's how the cities get more money from the public without having to officially say they're raising taxes. But what happens when everyone stays home? Less parking meter revenue, less traffic tickets, less of all of that money that the city depends on just to keep the lights on. The government and the corporations have a deep vested interest in maintaining the status quo, so all their talk about peak oil and the planet running low on petroleum and all their chatter about greenhouse gases and all their talk about people focusing on families is revealed to be a total lie. They say those nice things for the rubes who they want to vote for them, but when people actually do what they say, they attack them for it. And that brings us to the reason for this morning's briefing. Just to show these idiots don't know whether to spit or go blind, Officer Adams and the New York City Council are now stepping up their efforts to get more money from the people who they're demanding come back to the city center. And you have the white media cheerleading for this to become a nationwide trend. Officer Adams and the New York City Council want to make downtown New York into a toll zone, where you have to pay a premium fee just to get in. Downtown is where the governmental offices are at, and it's where the business district is at. By forcing New Yorkers to pay a fee just to get into downtown, they're actually taxing people to access the very government that their tax dollars pay for. It is putting in place a financial barrier to prevent the very citizens of New York from having access to what is supposed to be their government. That's what democracy means. It comes from the ancient Greek word meaning the rule of the people. This is the very antithesis of democracy. But as black people already know, the U.S. is not a democracy and never has been, because democracy and white supremacy are contradictions. And notice the white media is cheerleading for this. They're saying this needs to become a nationwide trend. And make no mistake, this is an endorsement of this idea. Naturally, of course, the Biden administration has been fully behind this. They totally wholeheartedly support this idea. Now, of course, like all fascistic schemes, they try to make it sound like it's meant to solve a problem. In this case, heavy traffic in downtown New York. Gee, if only the people who were supposed to be working in downtown New York didn't have to come to work. Most of the people who work downtown have jobs that could easily be done over the internet. If only the city started an initiative to encourage and make working from home the standard. Make it easier for only the people who absolutely have to go downtown to New York to go downtown. Everybody else just stays out. They could call it, I don't know, remote work or something. Now, wouldn't that be a radical idea? There would be less people in downtown New York, less traffic, less pollution, if only it was possible for people to work from home. Because if they did, then Officer Adams and the city council wouldn't be needing to put this policy in place, right? But let's be honest, for the mega wealthy financial overlords of New York, you could reduce the traffic there by 80% and they still wouldn't like it. They would still say there's too many people in this town. What they want is for New York City to be like Dubai, a playground only for a handful of ultra-wealthy plutocrats, and the only non-plutocrats who would be allowed in would be just the people who clean their condos and babysit their brats. When Mike Bloomberg said that New York City, and Manhattan in specific, is a luxury product, this is what he meant. So it's not about reducing traffic at all. If that was the goal, then there would be a greater push and a greater drive to make sure that remote work becomes standard. And for the people who have to come into downtown, make it where they're restricted to certain days. But that's not what's going on here. This is just another scheme to keep certain people out of what the rich consider their turf and to generate more income from the people who they're forcing to come back to downtown because the profits and the financial futures of the plutocrats depends on it. But of course, no gentrification scam would be complete without making sure there's plenty of exceptions and exclusions for certain select parties. So the white power brokers and the white people in power, the ones who have been pushing policies like these, they're going to be excluded from these policies. It won't apply to them. Remember, this is happening in a so-called blue city, and Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD, who also moonlights as mayor, is the one pushing it. I know a number of Democratic shills and bootlicks and people who are just plain stupid lurk around here and try to run interference for this mess. Well, this is what you've been supporting. A white supremacist in blackface who has been pushing policies every bit as damaging to the black community as anything Bloomberg or Giuliani ever did. Now you know why white power was so eager to endorse Eric Adams for mayor. Because they had already gotten his assurance and his pledge that this is exactly what he would do if they made him mayor. So Adams has gone from merely demanding that people come back to the offices downtown to now complaining that there's too much traffic downtown. But people need to understand this was the plan for the very beginning. Adams and his white paymasters want to have it both ways. As Neely Fuller taught, that's what white supremacy is all about. It's about taking both sides of the conversation. They've tried to shame people into coming back downtown, and that hasn't worked. So now they're just going to be using force to compel people to come back to downtown and then tax them for doing it. This way, the landlords who own the office buildings start to get paid again, the banks get paid, and the city gets to take in more revenue. This is about keeping their machine going. This is about trapping New Yorkers into giving their money to the corporations and politicians whether they want to or not. This is state-sponsored theft, and it turns the citizens of New York into trespassers in their own city. But as the headline said, they want to do this in other cities as well. So if you think that this is just going to be limited to crazy New York, think again. All these politicians nationwide, in every city and hamlet, use the exact same handful of tricks to rob the people of their money. But taxing people for entering the downtown area that they live in, for daring to go into the very downtown that their tax money built and sustains, this is just another step on the road to full-blown plutocracy in the U.S. For all you nitwits out there saying to vote for the Democrats because the Republicans are dragging the country towards fascism, well, you have the largest plan to dismantle the most basic form of democracy, freedom of movement, and access to your government, taking place not in fascist Florida, though I'm sure the racists down there are watching New York with envy, but in the largest blue Democratic enclave in the nation. This is what the Democratic Party is doing. This is what Joe Biden is doing. Turbocharging the plutocratic takeover of America, just like he turbocharged the prison industrial complex in the 90s with Biden's law, aka the 94 crime bill. Now the plan is to punish workers merely for not wanting to waste their money on gas they can't afford, waste their time in commutes they don't need for jobs they don't like. And now Officer Adams and the other crooks in the New York City government are forcing those people to go back downtown needlessly and have the nerve to complain that there's too many people going downtown when that's what they ordered people to do. They're proposing a solution to a problem they created, a problem they demanded. There can be absolutely no argument now that the Big Apple is revealed to be totally rotten and infested with worms like Eric Adams. Worms that are now eating the people of New York. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Sherman Marshall, Mike Hughes, Alan Reese, Kenneth Johnson, and Nora Brown. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.